Chapter 4. To Live Without Sight. What would the new adjustment center for the blind be like? Some people assumed it would be another home for the blind, or, since we had teachers, the facility would be another school for the blind. Others believed the center would be a workshop for the visually handicapped, or perhaps a small hospital. Actually, from the moment we opened our doors, the Pre-Vocational Adjustment Center for the Adult Blind became a combination of all these elements. The new facility functioned as part home, part school, part workshop, and part hospital, and most importantly, became an innovative effort to help blind people adjust to their handicap. Following the Lions Club's successful campaign to raise the initial funds, we set out to locate and furnish a building to house the center. With Mr. Combs serving as our committee chairman, we began an exhaustive search for the best available location. I wanted an old residence within walking distance of downtown Little Rock, or at least a place conveniently located on the bus line, so we could make downtown travel part of our training program. My bias toward this area stemmed from my student days at the School for the Blind. Back then, the school was situated where the present governor's mansion now stands, and I had many fond memories of catching the streetcar or walking to town on pleasant spring afternoons, and I wanted the trainees at the new center to enjoy the same opportunities. Our committee found several excellent prospects in the area near downtown. Unfortunately, no one wanted to rent their property because of the post-war rent controls. We could only acquire a residence in the preferred section by purchasing the property, which the Lions could not afford to do. After several frustrating months, I located an alternative site in the Oak Forest neighborhood, a newly annexed section in the southwestern part of the city. As a result of a rezoning case on the city council, I stumbled on a 17-room mansion called the Brack Home on South Tyler Street and Fair Park Boulevard. During the war, the house had been used by the United States Bureau of Mines as an office and laboratory for government officials searching for bauxite ore in the area. At the war's conclusion, the place had been abandoned and soon became the victim of neglect and vandalism. The possibilities offered by this two-story house, which included a floored attic, basement, garage, servants' quarters, and substantial acreage, muted my disappointment at not finding a location closer to downtown. I even saw potential in Oak Forest, although at that time the sparsely populated neighborhood served primarily as a lover's lane for local teenagers. Oak Forest had grown slowly, and the city only annexed the area in the early 1940s. But the neighborhood contained beautiful tree-lined streets, and most importantly, the bus company had recently established a line linking Oak Forest with downtown Little Rock. Mr. W.R. Davis, the operator of a car wrecking business on Old Hot Springs Highway, owned the Brack House. During a lengthy series of negotiations, Davis insisted he only wanted to sell the property and not rent to us. Since I presumed his efforts were intended to drive up his rental price, I suggested our committee invite him to join the Lions Club. Davis accepted our invitation, and I suspect he thoroughly enjoyed being associated with many of the community's most prominent business leaders. Eventually, he agreed to rent us the Brack home for $250 a month for 1 year, with an option to buy the property for $35,000. After we signed the lease for our building, the committee began searching for some inexpensive furniture. From a casual remark by a friend from South Arkansas, I discovered that the government wanted to sell all of the furniture and equipment at the Japanese Relocation Center at Rower, Arkansas. That facility had been used to house the Nisei Japanese who were so cruelly and unfairly expelled from the West Coast during the war. I remember Finis Davis, Stanley Combs, and I rose before daylight one morning to make the trip to Rower to see if any of the equipment might be suitable for our needs. We discovered that a few weeks before the end of the war, the government had purchased several maple beds and new mattresses for the relocation center, but had never used them. That morning we bought 15 beds and mattresses and some other holdings at a ridiculously low price and laughed over our good fortune all the way back to Little Rock. On January 25, 1947, 50 members of the Little Rock Lions Club swarmed over the grounds of the Brack home armed with brooms, rakes, shovels, and wheelbarrows. They assaulted the debris that cluttered the place, hauled away the trash, replaced the broken windows, and prepared the mansion for its new occupants. That spring, the first trainee arrived at the center, and on May 5th we held the formal dedication of the Pre-Vocational Adjustment Center for the Adult Blind. If I had to select the most memorable days of my life, that first Sunday in May 1947 would certainly be one of them. The afternoon ceremony took place outdoors in the balmy spring sunshine, and the whole day symbolized a great transition in my own life, the beginning of a new era. Finis Davis, the president of the Little Rock Lions Club, served as master of ceremonies and introduced our distinguished guests, including Arkansas Governor Ben Laney, Little Rock Mayor Sam Wassell, and Ashley Ross, the director of the Vocational Rehabilitation Division of the Arkansas Department of Education. Stanley Combs, our club's immediate past president, formally presented the keys to the building to Hugo Norvell, the president of the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind, which the new name of the Arkansas Employment Services for the Blind. And I introduced our guest speaker and old friend, Joseph Klunk, the chief of the services for the blind in the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in Washington. In his remarks that day, Joe eloquently interpreted to the public in general, and the attending Lions Club members in particular, the purpose of our new program. He told all of us that the loss of sight need not be a disaster to human nature. He also pointed out that we wanted to eliminate the sense of helplessness which inevitably follows the loss of vision. The public must be made to realize, he said, that blindness does not result in a lifetime of uselessness and helplessness. I accepted Joseph Klunk's words that day as a personal challenge to strive to give the trainees who came to our center the tools to begin a new life based on self-confidence and the opportunity to be productive citizens. Lyons District Governor Ed Berry also attended the dedication. During the course of the afternoon, a photographer snapped a picture of Berry, Klunk, the governor, and myself, which appeared in the following morning's Arkansas Gazette. Ed immediately telephoned me and said, "Roy, get a print of that picture and mail it to the Lions International magazine." That idea had never occurred to me, but I knew Ed's reputation as a salesman, so I followed his advice. As a result, the new adjustment center became the subject of an article, including the photograph, in the Lions magazine. I appreciated Ed's suggestion, especially since someone from outside of Little Rock had shown such interest in the project. During those first few months, we operated the new facility with an incredibly small staff. In fact, initially we hired only one full-time professional employee, a supervisor. The welfare department loaned us a home teacher who worked at the center on a part-time basis, teaching crafts, typing, and Braille, and we employed an older couple who lived in the servants' quarters to maintain the grounds and to serve as the kitchen staff. Of course, I spent as much time as I could spare for my duties with the STAND program, tending to the administrative matters and teaching orientation and mobility at the center. Even though we stressed crafts such as weaving and leather work to teach and evaluate manual dexterity, from the beginning I advocated the installation of a workshop to train people to use both hand and power tools. I thought the shop would help build the trainees' confidence in their ability to be productive in a sighted world. I drew my inspiration for the workshop from Joe Klunk. I had visited the Klunk home in suburban Maryland on several occasions, and each time I had marveled at the extensive woodworking shop Joe maintained in the basement. On each trip he showed me some new project, such as a bookcase or a dollhouse that he had created with his power tools. At first my workshop idea encountered some vehement opposition. I remember Stanley Combs, the financial advisor for the center, once told me, "No, Roy, I don't want to be part of buying equipment like that for these blind people. They might cut off their hands or something worse." Stanley's comment typified the attitude of many sighted people. He wanted to help the blind, but he had little confidence in their ability to accomplish much. I persisted in my requests for the money for the shop and tried to patiently explain to Stanley and our other board members how valuable the workshop would be to our trainees. Finally, Stanley visited my office one day and said, "Okay, go ahead and buy that stuff, but don't let me know about it, because if one of those blind people has a terrible accident, I would always think it was my fault." I assured him everything would be all right, and immediately converted the old bauxite laboratory into a workshop with a lathe and a drill press. Over the years, the shop expanded to include a variety of power saws, sanders, drills, bench grinders, and other woodworking tools, and after 30 years of operation, not one single blind person has ever been seriously injured in the workshop at the center. At the same time we built the workshop, we also converted the basement of the Brack home into a home laundry for training purposes and an exercise room where the trainees could pedal a stationary bicycle, skip rope, or take a turn on the reducing machine. We believed the ancient Greek dictum of building a sound mind in a sound body applied to our blind trainees as much as it did to their sighted counterparts. Building those minds and bodies proved to be a difficult task. While I had no illusions of equaling the Army's Old Farms program, I did believe that our work could still help blind people who had been deemed non-feasible for vocational rehabilitation. In many ways, the center presented an even greater challenge than the Avon project. While the government's job had been to rehabilitate a group of young, reasonably educated and motivated men, civilian centers such as the one in Little Rock received blind men and women of various ages, intelligent levels, and educational, social, and economic backgrounds, and tried to aid them in adjusting to their handicap, often with minimum staff and facilities. Our first two trainees illustrated the extent of this challenge. Ernest Cheatham, a 43-year-old school teacher from Deer, Arkansas in Newton County, had suffered from infantile paralysis, which left both of his legs withered. After attending college, he worked as a teacher until glaucoma robbed him of his sight a few years before he came to the center. The vocational rehabilitation people classified Ernest as non-feasible, but he had a positive attitude, and we were hopeful our new program could help him adjust to his multiple handicap. The other trainee, an illiterate man who often joked that he could not remember whether he attended school 1 or 2 days in his life, had been blinded in an industrial accident at the Alcoa aluminum plant. He had done some farm work and WPA-sponsored road work before finding employment in a defense plant. While working for Alcoa, he had been unable to read the directions on a lever and consequently had twisted the wrong valve, releasing a torrent of acid directly into his face. He wanted to open a small grocery store, but I had little hope for his success, especially since his wife was also illiterate. Nevertheless, I personally taught him orientation and mobility and tried to design an individualized program at the center that would meet his needs. After 4 months of training, Ernest Cheatham returned to Deer, resumed his teaching post, and taught the necessary 5 years he needed to qualify for his teacher's retirement. He then moved to Walnut Ridge, where he taught for a while at Southern Baptist College. Our illiterate trainee learned the necessary skills to open and operate a home laundry in Malvern, which he used to support his family for 12 years before his death. The success of these 2 individuals, our first trainees, gave me great hope and inspiration for the future. The concept of the center as a statewide Lions project seemed sound, and we had proven that we could rehabilitate at least some non-feasible individuals. During that first year, the Adjustment Center offered training to 18 people from Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, and served as a learning laboratory for all of us. Since we had no models to copy, we had to learn from the day-to-day operation of the center. I recall on one occasion we brought in an Ozark Mountain boy who spent most of his time strumming an off-key guitar and singing mournful country songs in a voice that the supervisor assured me could be heard in the next county. "You just can't imagine how corny this gets," she told me repeatedly. Soon after the first year, this supervisor resigned and returned to her teaching career, which created my first personnel problem. After interviewing several people for the position of supervisor, I began to realize how many sighted individuals are actually frightened of blind people. I found myself assuring some prospective employees, "You never know what your emotional reaction to these blind trainees will be, but I want to promise you that you can't catch blindness." As our new program developed during those early years, I added some additional staff members to the center, including a fascinating individual named Jack Kinney. Jack originally came to Little Rock from California to study our center with the intention of starting a similar project in his own state. But in February 1948, he accepted a position as the training director at the AEB's Prevocational Adjustment Center. An Army pilot during World War I, Jack had later become a successful executive with the Pacific Coast Oil Company. Then, while flying a private aircraft near the California-Oregon border, he had been injured in a plane crash that left him permanently blind. When the doctors informed me of my loss of sight, he later told me, the crushing feeling of utter despair is impossible to describe. I felt totally and completely lost. Self-destruction became a constant thought. Jack resisted his suicidal urges and exiled himself to a remote desert region in Death Valley, California. He had a simple philosophy. He would learn to survive and live as a blind man or he would die. He not only survived his self-imposed ordeal, but taught himself to cook, clean, and perform other household chores. He emerged from the desert as a well-adjusted, handicapped individual. During the years he worked for the center, the staff and trainees called him Happy Jack, and I have rarely encountered an individual with a more positive outlook on life. In discussing an incoming class, he loved to say, "This looks like a good group, Roy. We'll send them back with chins up, shoulders back, self-reliant, freed from the fear of being a tax burden." At the center, he directed our training program, taught orientation and mobility, and helped the trainees learn to do things like eat in public without embarrassment. Along with these duties, Jack devoted countless hours to traveling around the state, speaking to Lions clubs, and promoting our program by telling the Lions what we were accomplishing and what we planned to do in the future with their help. He educated this audience to the nature of blindness, good-naturedly commenting that to a blind man, all women are beautiful, all lawns are trimmed, and all houses are newly painted. Jack always closed his speeches by saying, "I'll be seeing you again," and I'll always be thankful the center had such a dedicated and inspirational figure to deliver our message during those early years. We were also fortunate to have Ed Berry aiding our cause in that crucial formative period. As district governor, Ed traveled South Arkansas, and later as the first chairman of the Arkansas Lions Committee for Site Conservation, he toured the entire state speaking to Lions clubs and telling the story of the center. Everywhere he spoke, his enthusiastic spirit seemed to be contagious. Ed loved the Lions Club, and in 1950 he decided to run for the board of directors of Lions International. I helped plan his campaign, even though I could not attend the convention in Chicago that year. When Ed won the election, he gained a national platform from which he continued to promote the center. A few years later, Ed's employer, the Arkansas Power and Light Company, transferred him to Little Rock, where he affiliated with our Lions Club. Many of our members, plus numerous friends from his tenure on the international board, began urging him to run for third vice president of Lions International. A devoted believer in the center, Ed served on the AEB board and always said in his speeches that the Lions are doing a lot for the blind, but the program for the blind is doing more for the Lions. When he asked me if I thought a campaign for third vice president would hurt the center because the clubs in the state would have to raise money which would not be going to the AEB, I told him I thought the publicity would actually benefit our work. The 1954 Lions Convention met in New York City, and a strong delegation from Arkansas chartered a plane to ensure the best possible attendance to support our candidate for the third vice president. Bernice acted as a hostess for the campaign headquarters in the hotel, and I made several speeches on Ed's behalf to other state delegations. The Lions sponsored a huge parade down Fifth Avenue the day before the election, and I'm sure the delegates from Arkansas were the only people who welcomed the torrential rains that fell on the city that day. We had earlier passed out plastic umbrellas, and when the marchers opened them as a shield against the downpour, the office workers in the buildings above saw a sea of umbrellas with the message, "Ed G. Berry for third vice president," lettered across the top. The full Lions Assembly met in Madison Square Garden with all the hoopla of a national political convention. At my suggestion, we convinced my old friend and fellow Lion, Congressman Brooks Hayes, to place Ed's name in nomination, and the University of Arkansas Band played a series of rousing songs for our demonstration. Ed won a narrow victory in New York, and after serving as third vice president and second vice president, he became the president of Lions International in 1957. In that capacity, he traveled all over the world, speaking to Lions clubs and serving as a goodwill ambassador for the Adjustment Center for the Blind in Little Rock. Everywhere he went, Ed told the story of what we were doing at the center, and I don't think we could have had a better spokesman than Lions President Ed Berry. We were particularly fortunate when, a few years later, Finis Davis was also elected president of Lions International. I had invited Finis to join the Lions Club in 1940 during his tenure as superintendent of the Arkansas School for the Blind. After he left the state to become the superintendent of the prestigious American Printing House for the Blind in Louisville, Kentucky, we remained close friends, and Finis continued his interest in our work in Little Rock. I was thrilled the day Finis became third vice president, the same year Ed became president. Here were two people in the hierarchy of Lions International who had been instrumental in helping me start the Rehabilitation Center. During their terms in office, both men remained enthusiastic supporters of our work and spread the word of what we were doing to Lions clubs throughout the world. To solve the problem of maintaining financial support during the first few years of the center's existence, I promoted a seal sale similar to the Easter Seal campaign. We sold our seals in November using the slogan, "Be thankful you can see." The campaign took a tremendous amount of the staff's time, even with help from volunteers, and by 1954 I decided the net return failed to merit the cost and effort involved. At that point, we shifted to a quota system for each of the 108 Lions clubs in Arkansas. I presented a budget to the AEB board, projecting what we would receive from the rehabilitation agencies in training fees. We then divided the resulting deficit among the various Lions clubs on the basis of the number of members in that club, the size of their city, and the amount they had been raising through the seal sale. Each club assumed the responsibility of raising their own quota. Some chose to continue the seal sale. Others opted for fundraising events like spaghetti suppers, minstrel shows, light bulb, and broom sales. The change to club quotas steadied our financial system, although as the Adjustment Center expanded, new sources of revenue became a continuous challenge. During the course of the center's first year of operation, I realized that our training would have to be done on an individualized basis rather than in groups or classes. But this approach required extra staff and additional financing. I convinced the rehabilitation people to increase their fees by explaining they were getting a bargain because the Lions clubs underwrote part of the cost. I also organized a conference of the rehabilitation directors of the 6 adjoining states to demonstrate our program and show how we could serve their clients as well as those from Arkansas. Eventually, this group organized an advisory board, which met annually and aided me in offering the blind people of their respective states the best possible services. After 3 successful years of the facility's operation, the delegates to the State Lions Convention in 1950 passed a resolution recommending the clubs raise $35,000 to purchase the Brack residence and make the mansion the permanent home of the Adjustment Center. Following the convention, I called a meeting of representatives from various clubs to discuss anticipated fundraising. During the discussion, several men voiced skepticism that the clubs could raise that much money. Finally, Ed Williamson, the district governor from Magnolia, said, "Oh hell, if the Lions of Arkansas can't raise $35,000, I'll resign and join the Rotary Club." His remark erased the tension in the room and resolved the issue, leaving everyone with a sense of renewed dedication. Through a variety of projects, the clubs raised over $30,000, and then some of our board members signed a personal note to borrow the rest of the money for the purchase of the Brack property. By the spring of 1950, my dream of an adjustment center for the adult blind had become an established reality. We had proven that our services could rehabilitate blind people and provide them with new opportunities. After purchasing the Brack home with the support of the Lions, we seemed well on our way to making the center a permanent institution. Our catchphrase, "We teach people how to live without sight," summarized our mission, and at that point I could not have been happier with the progress of the center. Unfortunately, I failed to note the dark clouds gathering on this bright horizon, and during the next 2 years my dream had to weather its first genuine storm. The origins of the center's first controversy dated back to before the war years. After the passage of the Randolph-Shepard Act in 1936, I approached Ashley Ross, the supervisor of the Vocational Rehabilitation Division of the Department of Education, to assume the responsibility of being the licensing agency for the new program. He referred me to the Welfare Department, and as a result, that department ultimately became the designating agent, paying my salary and supporting the STAND program. Over the next few years, Ashley Ross worked closely with our agency, paying the Arkansas Employment Service for the Blind a training fee to train blind people to operate the stands. His department then received credit for rehabilitating blind individuals. When the new Vocational Rehabilitation Act passed in 1943, I assumed the Welfare Department would remain the designated state agency. I even approached the Attorney General to secure a ruling to this effect. Unfortunately, Ross interpreted my action as an effort to take control of incoming federal funds away from the Vocational Rehabilitation Department. Although Ross, Welfare Commissioner John Pipkin, Ralph Jones, the Commissioner of Education, and I resolved this conflict at a lengthy meeting in 1943, the entire affair left a legacy of latent resentment toward the rehabilitation of the blind on the part of some general rehabilitation counselors. They continued to believe that I had tried to deny them federal funds. As a result of that same meeting, I moved my office to the Education Department, where I became the supervisor of the services for the blind. After organizing the center, I resigned and was succeeded in that position by a former rehabilitation counselor who had been away in the military service. Before the war, vocational rehabilitation only worked with crippled people, and my replacement had no experience in working with the blind. After he calculated the number of blind people that needed the pre-vocation services we offered through the center, he informed Ashley Ross that it would take all of the department's money if he referred blind people to the center. I assured Ross that many blind people would not accept our services for a variety of reasons, and his department had no need to become concerned. But many rehabilitation counselors did become alarmed. These people had always resisted the idea of separate rehabilitation counselors for the blind and harbored long-standing resentments against those of us involved in the work for the blind. At that time, the cost of rehabilitation of a visually handicapped person amounted to almost 10 times the cost of performing the same service for an ordinary crippled person, since paraplegics were designated non-feasible. Another point of friction between myself and the counselors resulted from my advocacy of a separate state agency for the blind. This idea was not a radical proposition, since 39 other states already had similar agencies to ensure that the blind received their equal share of rehabilitation funds. A survey conducted by the American Foundation for the Blind supported the concept and suggested Arkansas create a separate commission for the blind. Yet, in the Byzantine world of state government, many people viewed a commission for the blind as a threat to bureaucratic autonomy and therefore rendered vehement opposition to the suggestion of change. This antagonism crystallized after the AEB board helped draft a legislative proposal establishing a separate agency. The rehabilitation people regarded the proposed legislation as a personal attack on their work and marshaled their forces to successfully defeat the measure in the Arkansas legislature despite a due pass recommendation by a legislative committee. This legislative fight, combined with earlier animosities, resulted in the near destruction of the Adjustment Center. The rehabilitation counselors in Arkansas suddenly refused to refer any more blind people to our facility. They spread rumors to the effect that I kept most of the training fees and our clients did not receive the services we promised. The counselors discouraged blind people from coming to Little Rock and participating in the training at the center. They represented the Department of Education, and their disparaging remarks about a new program were taken seriously. The Rehabilitation People's Campaign also included a speakers bureau that gave talks before Lions Club throughout the state, insinuating the program at the center had failed and that the Lions should find another project to aid the blind. I refused to allow the center to close because of a vicious campaign by a group of narrow-minded bureaucrats. When our referrals from Arkansas stopped, I went on the offensive, visiting our neighboring states, explaining the center's program to rehabilitation workers and agency heads. The out-of-state referrals increased, and we managed to keep enough people at the center to justify our staff and keep the place going, but just barely. The conflict broke my heart. The blind people of Arkansas were missing the pre-vocational adjustment training they desperately needed because of the vindictive actions of the counselors. After receiving several discouraging calls from members of my own Lions Club, I called on our board of directors to resolve the situation. Board President Ed Berry called a special meeting of the board at the center in early 1952 and invited representatives of the rehabilitation counselors, the supervisor of the services for the blind, and Ashley Ross. We reviewed the history of the controversy, and I explained that in order to keep the center operating and providing needed services, we had to have the support of the vocational rehabilitation people. Late in the evening, the warring factions agreed to a peace treaty. We agreed to drop the idea of a separate agency for the time being, and they promised to refer blind Arkansans to the center for pre-vocational training. At the conclusion of the meeting, I experienced a tremendous sense of relief. The first major crisis for the center had passed, and the settlement of that controversy freed me to return to my mission to promoting and developing more employment opportunities for the blind.